Now, there's a lot of stuff going on with Mary Magdalene that is said in the guide and I feel is not said in the game whatsoever. I'll just kind of report that to you, and I honestly don't necessarily have an opinion either way because, you know, I kind of have to go by what the game says. And Mary is a very important person, but as far as I can tell, she is not necessarily fully explained in the game. So here's what I have learned. Mary Magdalene is the control mechanism for Chaos. She is supposed to stop him from pretty much prematurely destroying our universe before he has to. So they come in a pair, and they do seem to have quite a relationship together. They do seem to love each other, but her main goal is to control him. She is also necessary for Wilhelm's goal, but we'll get into Wilhelm later. But her main goal is to stop Chaos. Now, let's get into Chaos a little bit more and talk about the other thing that I told you not to Google, and that was Yeshua. At the end of the second game, Wilhelm calls Chaos Yeshua. And I told you not to Google that. Yeshua is Aramaic. It translates these days into Joshua. So Chaos's name is Josh. But that was his name in ancient times, in Jesus's times. I mean, let's just say it. That's where we're going with this. The name Yeshua back then, when it was translated into Latin and Greek, was not translated as Joshua, it was translated as Jesus. Jesus's name in Aramaic is Yeshua. If I remember correctly, it's Yeshua bar Yosef, or Yusef, which is Jesus, son of Joseph. But Wilhelm calls Chaos that. And in my mind, that kind of sets the stage, along with Nephilim. We'll go into Nephilim more later. Nephilim calls Chaos, or says to Chaos, that's what you tried to teach them. Trying to say that he was a teacher, right? And in my mind, that kind of sets the stage that Chaos is indeed Jesus. However, in the third game, in Chapter 9, if you have already beaten the game, you can rewatch the cutscene. I'll show you guys how to do that in a different video. Basically, it's data. But the cutscene, I have it up because I'm going to try to show a couple clips here and there as we go through. The name of the cutscene in Chapter 9 under the heading Mary is She Who Resembles Cosmos. And it starts with Shion finding Mary Magdalene's body in the coffin, and then we get this flashback to Lost Jerusalem. And this is the only time, as far as I can tell, in the game that we get any sort of inkling that Chaos is in fact not Jesus. There is a scene where there is a man on some sort of stage or raised platform of some kind, and he's giving a speech out to the audience, which does include Chaos and Mary Magdalene. And the idea that we're supposed to get out of that is that the man speaking is Jesus. They refer to him in the game as the Messiah. They refuse to say Jesus Christ in the game. And I think that has a lot to do with censorship, if you ask me. But they call him the Messiah. We're supposed to get the impression that that is the Messiah. But we also get the impression that Chaos is one of the apostles. The problem with that is that we heard the names of the apostles in the game. Remember, the names of the Zohar emulators are the apostles. There are 12 of them. I looked it up. They actually do have I'm blanking on it. They do have Hebrew letters on them. But in Hebrew, there's no difference between letters and numbers. They use them kind of as the same. So it turns out that they're probably better suited to be called Hebrew numbers. And they're just numbered 1 through 12. That's what all the emulators are. And we get them named off, right? We get all 12 named off. And then the original is called Marienkind, which means son of Mary. One of those names is not Yeshua. Joshua, Yeshua, however you want to phrase it, that is not one of the names that's listed as one of the apostles of the Messiah. Now, they try to explain that in the guide by saying that, humans kind of corrupted things and all this kind of stuff. But if you ask me, it sounds like they originally intended Chaos to be Jesus. Throughout the first 2 games. And then once they released the second game to the public, I don't know, maybe there was some kind of backlash. I didn't hear about it. I don't hear much about Xenosaga, to be honest with you, especially back when it came out. I didn't hear much about it, but it sounds like there was some kind of backlash, either from the fans or from somebody that worked in the company or something, and they're like, you know what, we can't have a playable character that's Jesus. So they kind of had to backtrack it a bit. And in the third game, they kind of reveal, no, wait, he wasn't Jesus. It was this other guy. And so that's kind of my opinion. That's not the majority opinion. The majority opinion, of course, is that it's the same story throughout, and that Chaos was always an apostle of Jesus and not Jesus himself. But based on a couple conversations with Nephilim and Wilhelm calling him Yeshua, I got the impression very early on that he was supposed to be Jesus. And I've stuck with that, even though they show something different in the third game in a cutscene. On top of that, if you read the guide, and the consensus opinion on this is also the same. Even though Jesus was a different person, the Messiah was the person that we see standing on the stage giving the sermon. The person that performed Jesus's miracles was actually Chaos. So it's kind of hard to, now you have to start asking yourself, well, what made Jesus Jesus? Is it what he said, or is it what he did? That kind of stuff starts kind of coming up, and they don't really give a full answer for that anywhere. Like, was Jesus also some kind of imaginary realm being like Chaos and Mary Magdalene were? They were the embodiments of powers that came from the imaginary realm? Or was Jesus a person who said some great things, but ultimately was just a human, according to the game? I don't want to get into religion here. We're just talking about the game, you know what I mean? But they never fully answer that, so I've never really known how to take that. And then there's also the question of who was in charge back then. Now, according to the guide, Chaos was Jesus's follower, that Jesus was in charge, and Chaos was instructed to essentially write down what later became the Bible. And Chaos tried, and I'm told kind of failed, and it got corrupted along the way, because Chaos wrote the words of Lemegeton, which are the words of God. Because he is the embodiment of anima, he's supposed to have just naturally known them. But that somehow it got lost in time, and he never tried to correct it. So that's kind of Chaos. And Chaos lived throughout that whole time, right? Mary Magdalene, as is kind of a popular story, it's not Catholic doctrine, I think. I'm not entirely sure who believes it in terms of official religion, but there are stories of Mary Magdalene after Jesus' crucifixion fleeing Palestine, as it was called back then, and going to southern France. And there are churches built in 2 key areas that I know of. There's one that was built where she landed, and then there's one built where she's might be buried, supposedly buried. traditionally buried. However you want to phrase it, they think she was buried there. Some people think she was buried there, especially the people that take care of that church, I'm sure. But she is buried in a place called Rennes-le-Château. That probably sounds very familiar to you. That was the floating landmass that we found. Now, according to the guide, because I didn't catch this during the game, I guess in order to limit Chaos's power, why they separated, I don't know, but in order to limit Chaos's power, she took his anima power and split it into 12 people. I believe the apostles, but it's not ever really said. Once again, not even in the guide is it explicitly said she give it directly to the apostles. But that's the implication, I would think. And those apostles that she gave it to are buried in Rennes-le-Château with her. And somewhere along the line, Wilhelm shows up, and he takes the vessels of anima, because she transferred him into the vessels of anima, which I think the implication is that she transferred the power directly into the apostles' spines, because right, it says very explicitly they look like human spines, right? It says something very similar to that, and so I guess that's the implication. I'm just purely pulling shit out of my ass right now, so if I'm wrong, I apologize. But that's what I remember hearing. So the implication is that Wilhelm at some point went to Rennes-le-Château, could not get Mary Magdalene's body because she died, and she transferred her power to the Maiden of Mary, who was later reincarnated as Xion, but for the time being, we'll just say the Maiden of Mary. She transferred her power to the Maiden of Mary. She transferred the anima into these other people, and she died. And then the people that had the vessels of anima died, and the Maiden of Mary died. But Chaos doesn't die. I don't know. I don't get it. Either way, they're all dead, and I don't know about the Maiden of Mary, but Mary Magdalene and the people that had the vessels of anima are then buried at Rennes-le-Château. Wilhelm shows up, and this is really one of the parts where I feel like the guide is lacking. They say somehow he got the vessels of anima, but couldn't get Mary Magdalene's body, and therefore he could not get all the things that he wanted from there, because he wanted all of that. He wanted anima, he wanted animus, he wanted he wanted all that so that he could do his ultimate goal. And that then kind of brings us forward. How he saved Rennes-le-Château as a whole, I honestly don't know either. They don't really go into that. But why it shows up later, Rennes-le-Château shows up later, is that it was somehow transferred to the realm of imaginary numbers, and then transferred back at that key point in time, most likely due to the appearance of Abel's Ark. Right, Abel's Ark shows up, and that's when Rennes-le-Château shows up. So it doesn't obey the laws of physics either, because it's also kind of linked to the realm of imaginary numbers, and that's why there's things like gravity on it. Anyway, let's talk about Wilhelm, which is probably the most obscure character and probably the most obscure plot point I feel in the game, and the games as a whole, really. It's never really explained what Wilhelm is. Wilhelm is kind of a being of the imaginary numbers realm, just like Mary Magdalene and Chaos are. It's never explicitly said what his power is, so anima, animus, he's kind of a third thing that I don't know the name of. But he is attempting to also kind of save the lower domain that we exist in, and all the other universes as well. He's honestly probably a good guy in a lot of situations. He's not necessarily the big bad evil guy that maybe he appeared to be, especially at the end of the third game. He is trying to do something called eternal recurrence. In other words, he's trying to reset the universe, right? He kind of told us that, and that's how he gets the testaments on his side. And what he tells them is kind of true. He's manipulating them, obviously, but it's still kind of true. He tells the testaments that, remember those good old days? They can come back if we reset the universe. He doesn't tell them, though, that according to everything that he knows, the universe will play out exactly the same way every time. So when he tells Kevin, you know, we can go back in time by resetting the universe and then we can save your mom, right? Which is probably the basics of what he told him. He didn't tell him that, well, you can try to save your mom, but she's going to die pretty much no matter what, which is what he believes. What he's doing is honestly, another failsafe to prevent our lower domain from exploding all the other universes as well. So honestly, it's not necessarily evil in itself. But this time, from what I understand, our wills have changed. Specifically, our party's wills have changed enough that we have evolved past the point where we are going to turn into Gnosis again. That's the implication. Whether it's flat out said, it's debatable, but that's the implication, is that we are essentially not going to destroy our own world by becoming Gnosis because we were too scared to be linked to one another. Which is, you know, once again, kind of a dumbed down way of talking about it, but I'm trying to be simple.